George R.R. Martin is a master at keeping readers interested. Today, I want to unravel one of the many ways he does that so that we can understand it and maybe use it in our own writing. I'm going to refer to a direct example from his series A Song of Ice and Fire and also show my own attempt at using this technique in one of my novels. By the way, if you're new, I'm Kieran, I'm a writer and a freelance editor, and I love helping writers to tell their stories while having fun doing it, so thanks for being here. I want to start by asking you a question. Have you ever been reading a book and got to the end of the chapter and then just somehow never ended up picking the book up again? I have, and sometimes it's not our fault as writers. If readers just don't continue reading, you can't win them all. It's impossible. But we can still do our best to avoid that happening, and the way George R.R. Martin does this is actually two ways. Firstly, cutting off the chapter before it has a chance to slow down, then picking up the next chapter when it's already interesting. It sounds really simple, and to be honest, it is. So thanks for watching, see you next time. Except it's not quite that simple. The best way to figure it out, as with all writing techniques, is to see it in action and then maybe try it ourselves. I'll run through the example now, and then I'll show you my attempt, and I'll give you some pointers for trying it yourself. I'm going to assume that you're probably familiar with some of the characters and storylines I'm going to talk about here. Most people seem to have watched Game of Thrones if they haven't read the books. I'm talking about the books, by the way, not the show, though it does kind of work the same. Don't worry if this is all brand new to you and you've no idea who Ned Stark is and you think a White Walker is what people call me when I take a stroll in the sunshine. Don't worry. I'll give you all the information you need to know, but there will be minor spoilers. My example is from book 2 in the series, which is called A Clash of Kings. We're following Jon Snow, who's a man of the Night's Watch, an ancient brotherhood of castaways and misfits tasked with manning the wall, the boundary between the Seven Kingdoms and the land to the north of it where there dwell lawless wildlings and maybe even spooky monsters. Also, he's got a pet direwolf. We join him as he's camped beyond the wall and about to splinter off from the group to scout what lies further into the mountains with hardened ranger Corrin Halfhand. Here's how this chapter ends. Dawn had broken when Jon stepped from the tent behind Corrin Halfhand. The wind swirled around them, stirring their black cloaks and sending a scatter of red cinders flying from the fire. We ride at noon, the ranger told him. Best find that wolf of yours. So, what does this do to keep readers interested? How does it avoid them putting down the story? In my opinion, a couple of things. Firstly, it leaves something unsaid. It leaves some story on the table because this chapter could have gone on. There could have been more to it. George Martin could have written a scene wherein Jon Snow looks around the place where they're all camped in search of his wolf ghost. Or he could have shown Jon packing up his belongings ready for the trip and ruminating on what may lie ahead. But he didn't, because that's not necessarily that interesting. There's no conflict or tension in a man looking for his dog when there's no reason that the dog might be missing. And there's no unanswered question in a man packing his bag if we already know where he's going. But what about when they get started? They're setting out on a journey in this section after all. That's exciting, isn't it? I think so. But only up until it's not. So the decision's been made. The orders have been given from command there to set off into the wilderness to face who knows what. They take those first couple of steps out of the tent and into the danger of the snow. Absolutely. All exciting, all engaging. But the thing with a journey is, once those first few steps have been taken, the ones that follow are likely to be the safest steps of all. Still close to home, and not far enough to discover anything new, so not too exciting. So cutting those details, instead of showing them to us, stops the pace from slowing down. It stops the tension from easing, which is, I think, the moment when readers might be most likely to put the book down. In fact, not only does it avoid that, I think it does the opposite. Cutting off the story right at the moment they've taken those first grand steps creates a ramp. The upturn in momentum as they take their first steps is cut off, in a sense propelling us forward towards the next chapter so that we read on. It's not just the decision to send them scouting that keeps our interest either. There is more to it than that. The dialogue helps keep us engaged too. Corrin's words, best find that wolf of yours, at first sound like they could simply mean, find the dog before we go. But what he's really saying is, where we're going, we're going to need your wolf's protection. Even if that only occurs to us in the very backs of our minds as we're reading, it raises our apprehension. Makes us contemplate what might be coming, what they might be walking into. It asks a question to which we do not yet know the answer. That all adds to that ramp, propelling us forward. That's just how he ends chapters. That's half of the technique. There's more coming, but let's quickly recap that section. When you're approaching the end of your chapter, try cutting it off almost mid-action when the pace is still fairly quick and the story's still moving. Find a way to cast your reader's mind into the next chapter by asking a question or raising a possibility. Where might the story go? Doing that can create a ramp that will propel your reader forward. So that's chapter endings. But what about beginnings? This is the other half. George R.R. Martin doesn't want to just waste all of that effort he's just gone through by shifting the problem to the start of the next chapter and just losing our attention then instead. That's where this next bit comes in. Let's look at the opening of the next Jon Snow chapter from the book. By the way, some of you, if you've read these books, will know that Martin alternates his character. So this Jon Snow chapter doesn't come directly after the last one. I'm going to talk about that in a little bit. Don't worry, I haven't missed it. So we ended with, "We ride at noon," the ranger told him. "Best find that wolf of yours." And the next chapter starts like this. They could see fire in the night, glimmering against the side of the mountain like a fallen star. It burned redder than the other stars and did not twinkle, though sometimes it flared up bright and sometimes dwindled down to no more than a distant spark, dull and faint. 1/2 mile ahead and 2,000 feet up, John judged, and perfectly placed to see anything moving in the pass below. So, how exactly does this contribute to keeping the reader engaged? What is it that stops us putting the book down? Maybe you can already feel it, but let me give you some context. In my opinion, there's a few things working together here to hook us back into the story. Let's start with that opening line, even just half of it in fact. They could see fire in the night. On a basic level, this is a good visual image for sure, very easy to imagine and to picture, and it's also a direct link from where we left off. Remember the embers being blown in the wind from a fire in their camp? That's a nice detail thematically, but it's more than that. The characters left on a scouting mission to find evidence of what might be out there waiting for them. This fire, out in all that dark and all that cold, is exactly that. A distant threat turned not so distant. With those two details working together, Martin does a pretty good job at hooking the reader's interest, I think. But what also helps is what he doesn't do. Before, I talked about how the last chapter cut off before the pace slowed down and before things got boring. This chapter does the same thing, but in reverse. We don't see how John and Corin and the other scouts get to where they are. We don't see the days of hiking without running into any wildlings or white walkers. We don't hear how they put one foot in front of the other in the snow time after time. Because those parts of the story aren't as compelling and we don't need to see them. So George R.R. Martin cuts those parts before we even start, before they even get written, so that the chapter gets going when things are already interesting. We start up again on a moving train. The story is making progress. It's already heading down the tracks from the very first word of the chapter. It's much harder to get off a moving train than a stationary one, and that's why I think it keeps readers so hooked. As well as the new stuff this chapter opening is offering us, we still have the unresolved stuff from the old chapter too. It all blends together to make things as interesting as possible, right at the moment where the reader might be most likely to phase out. So let's recap that. When you're starting your next chapter, try getting going when the train's already moving, so there's more momentum from the off, and refer back to the end of the last chapter with a common thread to make things feel cohesive. We could take that away and put that into practice right now, and I think we should do, but before that, I want to show you an example of how I've tried to use this myself. By the way, I don't use my own work as an example because I believe my writing is brilliant or as a marketing ploy to sell books. I simply use it because I know the text well and I know what I was trying to do with it and whether I succeeded or not. First though, I mentioned before that the point of view switches every chapter in A Song of Ice and Fire, and you may have spotted a potential problem with this technique. Namely, how can that ramp and hook thing still work if the character's changing and the story's changing every end of every chapter? The ramp will still make sense, you can still get momentum from that, but the hook will be a whole different thing from a whole other chapter and a whole other character. Absolutely, it's not always super simple and perfectly ordered, but I actually think it's better that the chapters aren't back to back running into each other. I think overall it makes the hook for readers stronger, and it makes it even harder to put the book down. Every character has their own ramp and their own hook for their own storyline. And when I say that they all have them, it's not this noticeable thing, this really pronounced and constant structure. There are chapters that end quietly, and there are chapters that start slowly, because there just has to be for the story. Nothing is absolute and unwavering like that. But there are enough examples of this technique to ensure that there's always a reason to read on and keep going. It's not that hard to implement either. I think the key thing is remembering that you don't absolutely have to do this every single time for every chapter in every point of view. It just might be a good idea to do it here and there. That's what I did with my book Project Ventus, which is also multiple character, multiple POV. I've got an example here that's kind of similar. My character, Teppo, is also hiking as I end his very first chapter. He's branching off from his research partner, taking a risk, and heading into the Ural Mountains in search of a certain historic location. Here's how I ended the chapter. As the sun rose, Teppo could feel a faint warmth on his face. He felt bright, as though he was no longer standing in shadow. When he turned back, he could just make out the distant shape of his friend, heading back to civilization. So, I cut off the very start of a journey, just like with Jon Snow. After the parting of my two characters, I knew there wasn't going to be anything exciting happening, so I just cut it there. I also wanted to bring in a sense of isolation and smallness to the character as well. Teppo deals with chronic anxiety, and I wanted to enhance his vulnerability, so I created distance between him and Jasper, his friend, who's heading back to the world, away from him, and I removed the shadow over him so that he has no place to hide. There's more context to the scene, of course, but I was just hoping that the reader might feel some of his apprehension at what might lie ahead. Those things together, cutting it off at the right time and asking the question of what might he walk into, I think might create that ramp. Then when we rejoin him in his next chapter, I tried to go for that hook to get readers' attention again, so here's what I wrote. He could feel his pulse in his temples. Within just 100 meters was their purpose, the reason he and Jasper had had so much trouble securing funding, the reason they both had to work so hard. To Teppo, it was the reason he would never have considered turning back for anything, no matter how much snow there was or how strong the wind blew. It does work slightly differently because as well as multiple POVs, I also have a past and a present timeline for each character, so we see Teppo's past bit first and then we get to this. But in the grand scheme of things, it fundamentally works the same. He could feel his pulse in his temples, I think lets us know that there's drama or tension or apprehension which follows on from that previous chapter. Then I have that overarching question of what is he walking into? What is this site he's been hiking to? Like George R.R. Martin, I also didn't show the many miles of boring hiking between point A and point B because nothing eventful happened and it wouldn't have been very compelling. Alright, let's recap everything so far. To avoid giving readers an opportunity to put your book down, perhaps try the two-sided technique we've talked about, the ramp and the hook. End your chapters before they get a chance to get boring and carry something over, be that an unanswered question or an unresolved situation. Then start your next chapter by linking back to the previous one while making sure that the story is already moving from the first line. Give it a try and let me know in the comments how you found it. I love hearing from writers about their experience with their stories. If you like this video, here's a whole playlist of tips and advice from famous authors, George R.R. Martin included, twice. Have a look through them and see if your favourite is among them. If not, let me know. Thank you so much for watching as always, and happy writing.